Hello, so I'm thinking about responding to some more Amazing Atheist videos just because this video actually has some significance for me. I used to be anti-feminist, and it was largely because I didn't think about feminism, it didn't come up on my radar, and then I watched this video, the video I'm about to respond to by the Amazing Atheist, and that made me anti-feminist, and I was until I read a fucking book.
Feminism is the idea that we can make both sexes equal by focusing solely on the issues of one of them.
Okay, so there are 2 points wrong with this. The first point is that feminism is not really the idea that you can make women equal. Feminism is actually the empowerment of women and the advancement of women, the same way that the American Civil Rights Movement was about the advancement of African Americans, the same way that the LGBT movement is about the advancement of people in the LGBT community. While it's true that feminists do advance a lot of male issues, and I will go into that, it's inaccurate to say that the goal of feminism is gender equality. The goal of feminism is the advancement of women, which will move us closer to gender equality because of how disadvantaged women are historically, which I'll get onto. The second issue I've actually already addressed, which is that feminism, no, it doesn't just regard issues facing women as important. It addresses a lot of issues, including, thanks to intersectionality, which is a big part of the third movement, issues affecting workers, issues affecting people of colour, issues affecting homosexual and trans people.
But no, feminists explain to me that all inequality that exists between the genders favors men over women. All of it.
It is perhaps true that some feminists have said to you that only women are disadvantaged by gender inequality. That doesn't really affect feminist theory. Wait. Okay. Feminist theory, generally, in all of it, in the hundreds and 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 hundreds of pages regarding feminist theory, there is in each book a paragraph or two dedicated to issues faced by men. I don't think a single author of any feminist book has ever said that men have not been disadvantaged by patriarchy. I mean, this book talks about it quite a bit, basically, because it talks about war, and how war is a consequence of patriarchy, and how the majority of people negatively affected by war will be men, because they're soldiers. Those are just the books I could find on my shelf immediately. So I'm not really. I mean, is your argument that some feminists don't really understand feminism? Because, if you're going to be anti-feminist, there are a lot of anti-feminists I could point to, and I don't think you really want to get into that game.
Domestic violence against men is nearly as common as domestic violence against women, but it's not taken as seriously.
Domestic violence in general, and domestic violence in men included in that, is generally taken more seriously by feminists than it is by any group at all. Now, this is especially the case regarding rape of men. I know that this doesn't really necessarily fall under domestic violence, but it does fall under violence against men. If you go onto any feminist forum, particularly something like the feminist forums on Reddit, which are generally quite critical of Reddit's anti-feminism, you'll see the reaction to prison rape jokes. It's not pretty, and you definitely wouldn't do well making a prison rape joke, even if the subjects of the joke were men. The other thing feminists generally will despise is people who say things like, if a young boy has sex with a much older woman, then it's statutory rape. And people say, oh no, he must have enjoyed it. Feminists will reject that. Always. Apart from, again, the feminists who don't understand feminism, the feminists who might just say they're feminists and then go on to do whatever, and those are not the majority. I know that a lot of people say, oh well, if so many feminists act like that, then surely feminism is bad. They're not at all. And even if they are, I mean, how many socialists in the world haven't read a word of Marx or Engels? And does that mean that socialism is automatically turned into whatever they say it is? No, it doesn't mean that at all.
Female genital mutilation is considered horrible and abhorrent, and it should be. But male genital mutilation? That's still standard operating procedure throughout much of the US.
Circumcision isn't a feminist issue, I will give you that. Because, it doesn't really affect women at all. The reason why female circumcision is considered so horrible is because it is more horrible. Just because they're the same word doesn't mean they're the same procedure. Now, that isn't to say that male circumcision is excusable, and I do reject it. But the reason why female circumcision is taken more seriously isn't because females have some advantage over men and people care about them more. It's because the procedure is much more serious. And how many feminists do support circumcision of men? Really? Is feminism damaging your movement? Or is it religious traditions in Judaism, Islam, Christianity? Because I think it's probably not feminism that is getting in the way of progress with circumcision on young children. And I'm not suggesting necessarily anything that people might find objectionable, like how we should interact with groups that do have it as a cultural tradition. But the dialogue is going to take place, certainly with feminists, for the most part on the side of those either not taking an issue at all or being on the side of those advocating for circumcision. And it isn't because circumcision is a feminist issue, but it's because feminism tends to be associated with generally caring about your fellow human being and wanting to achieve equal rights for everyone, even if that's not exactly what feminism is. Feminists will, because of intersectionality, which I mentioned before, support the rights of workers, men, trans people, etc.
And if there's really such a compelling case to get rid of it, then why don't you let people decide to get rid of it as adults?
Who are you talking to? I know it seems like a weird point to bring up, but I just find it weird that in the middle of this section on feminism, you begin to passionately fight against those who defend circumcision. Feminists don't at all, really. Yeah, I mean, like, the worst it gets is some feminists say, no feminist is really going to disagree with your spiel here. It's nice that you said it because, I agree, and it's nice to agree on something, but it's not relevant.
A few of them said, yeah, those are real, but they too are caused by the patriarchy.
Hello, sorry, I had to get to the door, and then I got dinner, and then I had a cigarette and another beer, and in all that time I shaved my beard and put on my dressing gown, so changes. Let's see, what did he say? Okay. what he's saying is true. Obviously, yes, men are disadvantaged in the area of taking control of children. Women were seen as those who should take children historically, and that's why they're advantaged in custody. However, there is a very pronounced connection between the subjugation of women and maternity, and it's very elaborate and is worth a deep read. It's advanced in the second sex, which I don't have on me, but it's very good. And it's kind of tied to this whole metaphysical, spiritual thing, which was a big part of how society used to operate until, like 300 years ago. So that's basically how it worked. I don't really want to explain it because I couldn't explain it in like a decent amount of detail. But yeah, having control of the kids wasn't that good. Generally speaking. Another point to consider is the fact that men were generally regarded as stronger, and that connects to lots of things like the draft and the crime rates. These were obviously affected by positive perceptions of men. I don't see how you can ignore that fact. People weren't throwing men into battles because they thought they were completely dispensable. They were throwing men into battles because they thought they were very strong. And to make that point more clear, as I feel like you might say, oh, people did think men were dispensable. People didn't think men were any more dispensable than women. It wasn't because they loved women so much they didn't throw them into battle. It's that women would seem to be useless in battle.
All feminists believe in the patriarchy. It's part of feminist theory. The patriarchy, according to Wikipedia, is a social system in which the role of the male as the primary authority figure is central to social organization and where fathers hold authority over women, children, and property. It implies the institutions of male rule and privilege and entails female subordination.
I'm not going to make a snarky joke about the idea of getting your definition of patriarchy from Wikipedia. Obviously, if you wanted a really good understanding of patriarchy, you could read a fucking book. But it is an accurate definition, at least, a feminist wouldn't disagree with it. Obviously, TJ doesn't understand it, and we'll get into that, but it's not a bad definition. It could just do with a bit more background reading. It is the historical domination of men over women. It's very closely tied to private property. I don't have the second sex on me now, as I said, but I do have this, which you should buy. Mostly the reason you should buy it isn't because it's like brilliant, like it's not like the Bible or anything. It's just that it's Penguin Classics, and Penguin Classics are really good to get second hand on Amazon. Annoyingly, I think this book is also incredibly cheap, which is the other book I held up. So, if you would like to read, what is it? I don't know why I'm selling these books. 200 plus. About 450 pages of feminist. 450 pages of feminist theory. For like £4, then buy those. There are also some really good papers which are free, and I will try to link them, although I'm actually kind of in the process of connecting like a few more feminist papers. Most of them are JSTOR, a few others. So I'll try to link those in the description, and if you don't want to buy these books, they might be, I think, because it's by Engels, it will be on Marxist.org, the creation of the family. I don't know if creation of the patriarchy will be anywhere. But obviously these institutions, family, private property, the government, state, courts, police, army, all founded around this idea of males being dominant, and how that came to be is, 450 pages worth of literature, and not even, I wouldn't say you'd understand feminist theory on patriarchy if you just read those two books. You would have to read 2,000 pages rather. I think you have to read 2,000 words on any central concept before you can really understand it. But yeah, obviously patriarchy is this very deep, elusive, entrenched part of society that interacts in this in a way that requires the analytical theory that feminism provides, and of course TJ understands this completely.
Why would men, if we were looking to exploit women and run the whole show, say to ourselves, men should pay more child support, and fathers should have less rights, and men should have less reproductive rights than women?
Oh dear, TJ. Okay, I've got a lot to say in response to this. Obviously, he lists a load of things that are all the results of feminist advances for women. Basically, this is a bit like, imagine immediately after, actually no, okay, imagine the civil rights movement, okay? MLK stands up and he says, the trouble with this society is it's a society that works to preserve the interests of white people. It's a society that provides its obvious institutional advantages for white people. And he said all of that. And a white person said, or a racist said, if this society was dominated by white people, then why would we free the slaves? Or, imagine how rubbish it would be for the Chartists in the UK. We have this very interesting history of democracy in the UK and how different people got the vote. It wasn't anything like as simple as France or the US. So imagine if the Chartists who proposed the 1918 legislation, or I can't remember the exact dates of the other ones. I think one's 1867. I'm going to say 1867. If I'm wrong, then I'll just try and redact it. So imagine Chartists proposing the 1867 legislation, and someone says, they say, oh, we need the right to vote irregardless of how much property we have. We need just to have every single person or every single man get the vote freely, because that's how a democracy should work. And someone said, well, hold on a minute. If society is run by the wealthy elite, as you claim, then why did we give millions of people increased franchise rights earlier on in the century? It's disingenuous, bordering on horrible, to take the advances, the hard-won advances of certain causes, and then to say, well, you claim that society doesn't support you, but we did this. The fact that women have gained advances in custody, not custody, but child support, abortion, domestic abuse, things like that. I think, and when was it, in 2000 and something, I believe, we introduced a law that basically said it's possible to rape someone you're married to. Prior to that, in the UK, we didn't have that law. If you were married to someone and you pinned them down and raped them, it would count as domestic assault of some sort. It wouldn't be counted as a sexual assault. So yeah, obviously there are still advances being made for feminists in Western societies, and no, every single time a new advance comes along, it isn't an excuse to go, oh, so the problems are solved. No, very rarely that's the case for any movement. I don't think any real movement has fully reached the end goals that they're based upon. But I am going to address why it is that, outside of the examples you gave, why it is that patriarchy seems to have a negative effect on men sometimes. And the first issue to consider is patriarchal ideas about masculinity. The patriarchy basically says that men should be really powerful, and that is not a bad, that's not an idea that's negative towards men, saying they should be powerful. But it is an idea that can have negative effects for individual men who aren't powerful. And, just because an idea, kind of a totalitarian idea, if you will, and it's awkward to call patriarchy totalitarian because it's not a policy of any conscious agent, it's an element of society, but it does give men this idea that they need to work really hard to advance themselves and become dominant and never be emotional and things like that. Bad, generally, but again, it's all part of the patriarchy that women are working to abolish. The second element to consider is that patriarchy is actually impossible. It is, absolute patriarchy. The idea that men would control absolutely everything and nothing would ever go against men. It doesn't work. There have been historical matriarchies, and one of the points advanced in Second Sex is that children tend to view society as matriarchal because of the role that the mother has in raising children. And that's also really interesting the way it kind of interplays with how children identify with their gender. Particularly, it means that young girls tend to identify with their gender more, and that's why they get into housework and things like that, whereas boys don't really have their father around a lot. And it means that they will tend to form more of an individualistic sense of gender, and one that's kind of less personal, because they don't identify with their father because their father will be at work or in the office. And yes, this book was written in late 1940s, I think, so I'm not suggesting it's exactly relevant today, but it's interesting from a historical perspective. But yeah, the greatest counterpoints to patriarchy have been made by feminists, and they aren't counterpoints to patriarchy, but they're ideas of feminists basically saying, well, this is an exception, and things like that. Anti-feminists are generally quite bad at critiquing the notion of patriarchy because they don't really understand it, because they haven't read the requisite 2,000 pages of literature on it. The final point to consider is that patriarchy is not a collaborative process. The same way that capitalism isn't a collaborative process for capitalists, it isn't like capitalism, the institutional protection of private property, was established so that capitalists could get together and laugh and have a few drinks and be fine. It was established so capitalists could compete, and they could compete to see who could get the most workers into their houses so they could get the most value out of those workers. These are the competitions capitalists had, and it's very similar with authoritarianism. Authoritarians will generally compete, if you have an authoritarian system, then people will get assassinated and then betrayed and things like that, because it establishes competition in the upper echelons of society. And this is the case with patriarchy. As a man in the patriarchy, I have a load of opportunities available for me. When I walk into a job interview, especially if it's something like business, which I've done before, and I did get the job, and there were 3 women. It was me, a man, 3 women. I was very confident for that interview because, of course, 3 women and a guy being interviewed by 2 male CEOs, and a huge percentage of CEOs are male now. They were joint founders of the company. So yeah, I got the job, and it wasn't hard at all. So that's just an example of the windows you have available to you if you identify with, you have an obvious sense of identity with the people who are currently in control of everything. The fact that if I were to become a politician, it would never be about, oh, he's a man, isn't that interesting? It would be about my policies. And that's a huge liberty. and I'm thankful for that. But at the same time, that puts me in conflict with all the other male politicians and all the other male CEOs or male people trying to get up the managerial system. It is just ridiculous to act like a system that enshrines kind of power and competition and things like that and acquisitiveness would bring about harmony amongst the people at the top. It generally doesn't, especially not when it's a social phenomenon instead of a political phenomenon. Those are all the real points to consider regarding why patriarchy negatively affects men. I mean, it should be more than enough to show that patriarchy can still exist.
And they show that for the majority of history, men had all the power. Yeah, but men were also expected to do all the work.
This is one of the biggest historical misconceptions ever. I don't know if I'm going to link to... And I think I will link to a lot of the things that disprove it. Not all of them, because, you know, books. I don't know if I'll link to the Amazon thing for books that are relevant. I don't think I can hold any more up. I should have some, but no. The way that women interacted with the economy is very complicated, and even if you stick to the most progressive school of historical economic analysis, which would be kind of the socialist idea of women intervening with or interacting with the means of production in certain ways, even then you've still got a lot of reading to do, and then you have to consider alternative ideas about how it works, so it's very difficult to have kind of the complete view of all of human history and women interacting. One of the things you see very quickly is that women weren't just lazy. Women had to work incredibly hard, and for the most part they had to work harder than men. The idea of a housewife as a social phenomenon has not existed for very much time at all. When people were peasants and they had to give 99% of their labour away to a feudal lord, they weren't thinking about, you know, the wife cleaning up the house. They had to work tooth and nail just to get the house, fight tooth and nail. I don't know what the word is for working. But this isn't even a matter of historical inquiry. We have societies like this, where we can see how women operate in economically underdeveloped countries. In Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, they have huge amounts of work, and, you know, we still say, I don't have this book either, but I can probably find some articles on it. We still say poverty is a woman's issue. That's one of the biggest parts of intersectionality, the connection between feminism and the ending of poverty, because of how negatively affected women are by poverty, because of all the work they have to do. Women have to do so much work, and they have had to do so much work, especially in the Industrial Revolution. They worked the factories, they dyed, they did textiles, they did so many of the big industries in the UK, and the relationship with the Industrial Revolution, how it affected women entering the workforce, is a huge part of Marx's conversation around the time. So definitely worth checking out. But even before women worked in industrial situations, they did a lot of weaving, they did a lot of carrying, they did a lot of farming, and they're always relegated to kind of the most menial, hard, handy stuff, because men worked all of it, the big ploughs and stuff like that. And I think if you want an example of a society where women kind of still do almost the Hellenistic role of weaving and things like that, you could perhaps look at Papua New Guinea, which incidentally has the highest rate of rape in the world. It's a horrible place for women, and there are no housewives in Papua New Guinea, I assure you. It is just grueling work to have a man take control of the finances. It is domestic capitalism. It is living in a house with a man who owns everything and then kind of working for him and giving him everything. That is how women have lived for most of their life. And the only real advancement for women has come from the advancement for workers in general. The increased wages workers have got, which is still only a fraction of the actual value they generate in the economy, but I'm not going to go into that. Generally speaking, the idea that women have profited from the historical subjugation of workers and the ongoing subjugation of workers is completely nonsense. And any socialist will tell you that, and no one knows workers like socialists.